Thank you. So I hope you don't mind, but I'm going to stand by the computer and change the slides from over here. So thank you very much for inviting me to present at this wonderful conference. It's a great pleasure. And also, I'm so pleased that I participated because it's really sparked an interest in ESOL, the interface between ESOL and sexuality. My area of expertise is the psychology of sexual health, so it's there is some overlap there, honestly, but it has been quite new territory for me, and it's been very enjoyable. So the title of my presentation is ESOL, an opportunity for challenging homophobia. And I want that to be the emphasis here. And I'm going to finish my presentation by providing some speculative remarks about how we might challenge homophobia within the context of the ESOL classroom. I'll begin by presenting a social psychological theory of representation, identity, and action. I'll then go on to talk about sexuality, migration, and identities briefly. And then I'll present my case study. And it's a case study of gay and bisexual Iranian migrants to the UK. It's a social psychological interview study that I conducted with a group of gay and bisexual Iranian migrants. The focus wasn't ESOL or English language at all, but this emerged organically in the course of the interviews. And after I presented my seminar in November of 2014, I decided to revisit the data and to explore the ESOL context as one context in which sexuality had been discussed and where individuals had to take a stance on their sexuality. I'll then, as I said, provide some speculative reflections on sexuality in ESOL and try to carve out some future pathways for research that can incorporate social psychological theory. Just before I begin, I've listed some papers that I draw upon in this talk and which obviously provide a fuller picture of what I'm trying to get across. So I had a book chapter published in Queering Religion and Religious Queers last year, which focuses on the original study. And I recently, very recently in fact, had a paper published in Language Issues which expands on this talk a little bit more, and also one in Perspectives, Policy and Practice in Higher Education, which discusses the theory a little bit more. Okay, so first of all, social psychological theory. I want to talk about IPT, identity process theory. And it's a theory of identity, how we construct our identities, how we construct our individual identities. The unit of focus is the individual, because that's what we social psychologists are interested in, but the individual embedded within a society, a social framework, context, and the individual who also has to take a stance on the ideologies in which he or she is embedded. An important starting point is that we construct our identities against the backdrop of social representations. Now, a representation is essentially a social construction of reality. And this will depend on the context that we're in, the culture that we're in. They are formed through two processes, anchoring and objectification. When we encounter something novel, we try to link it to something we already know about, to make sense of it. We use metaphors, and sometimes we forget that we're using metaphors when we try to make sense of that phenomenon. So let's think about in the LGBT domain and homosexuality and how that was regarded, how it was linked to mental illness, and that was provided as a sort of an explanation for this. It was the lens through which homosexuality was to be regarded. How is it objectified? Well, various metaphors may be used. Metaphors around sin, metaphors of the Pope, for instance, metaphorically referred to homosexuality through an ecological lens, that we have to protect the body, we have to protect ourselves as we protect the environment. These metaphors are very powerful because they provide windows for viewing the world, for viewing phenomena, complex phenomena such as sexual orientation. So these processes give rise to representations, and it's against that backdrop that we form a sense of who we are. Now, IPT argues that we don't just construct our identities in a random manner. We do it against the backdrop of representations, but also in a motivated manner. We're motivated by principles. Now, given that the focus is on the individual, the motives are also individual motives. We try to maintain a sense of self-esteem. We try to maintain a sense of control and competence, continuity in the face of inevitable change. We inevitably change, yet we have a narrative that explains these changes, that enables us to wake up feeling that we are the same person, the person that we were yesterday. Belonging within relevant groups. We also have multiple identities, and we use various terms to refer to this. We've talked of multiple truths, for instance. We're referring to very similar phenomena here, that we form part of various different groups, different traits coexist. But we have to take a stance on these traits when they somehow become linked because of social representations. And we have to maintain a sense of coherence between them. Now, the theory argues that when these principles are somehow jeopardized by changes in one's social context, by representations, our identity is threatened. Threat is aversive for psychological well-being. Human beings don't just sit around and do nothing, they try to be resourceful and to alleviate the threat, to resolve the threat. And I think that's the key to understanding homophobia, and I'll elaborate on this, because we can select strategies that work very well in the short term, like denying something, but which later come to the surface, which we can later no longer deny because other people don't allow us to, for instance. We may try to accept that threat so that it loses its power to threaten because we've accepted it. Now, at this point, I want us to think about the connection with ESOL, and I want to quote a recent article in Language Issues by Laila El-Matoui, who says, "Language acquisition, wherever you are in the world, can be hindered if learners are not in an environment which is conducive to fostering a welcoming atmosphere where all feel free to talk about themselves, their identities, and personal lives." Now, the way I see it is that this is about threat. This is about feeling able to manifest your identity without suffering threat. And indeed, the social cognition research demonstrates that when people are experiencing threat, it can dominate their cognitive processing and their engagement with the social world because they're so focused on trying to resolve the threat rather than learning, rather than focusing on the content of pedagogy, that they actually are less successful in that process. So that's why I think resolving threat is important. Now let me focus a little bit on sexuality and migration, given that I'm talking about gay Iranian migrants. There's been some very interesting work on the intersection of LGBT sexualities, ethnicity, and religion, and I think these are some of the factors that will be of importance here. That's why I'm talking about it. Some great work by Adrian Coyle and Deborah Raffelin looking at sexuality and religion among gay Jews in London. Andrew Yip's work, and he's based at Nottingham, looking at how people may queer religious text in order to render it more accommodating of their sexual identities. And I've worked quite closely with the LGBT Muslim community and written about different aspects of their lives and how they manage the tensions that can arise from their religious and sexual identities. Now, as was pointed out yesterday, there's very little research in the UK context looking at sexuality and migration. And some of the work that I read when I embarked upon this journey was that of Lionel Cantu, which of course takes a very different perspective from mine today, but was nevertheless very interesting because it helped me to understand a little bit about how ideology impinges on the very processes that I've just been talking about. One of the things that I'll be arguing is that, of course, migration clearly creates challenges, constraints for various reasons, socio-structural reasons, racism, experiences of racism, but also opportunities for the sexuality, ethnic, religious identity construction interface. Now, I'm focusing on migrants who come to the UK, so I want to say just a very few brief words about LGBT identification in the UK. And of course, we know this, but I want us to be mindful of this as I'm speaking. So if we look, for instance, at some recent work which has been really, really encouraging, I'm thinking of the work of Mark McCormack with his colleagues around the decreasing significance of homophobia within some school contexts, which is, of course, very, very encouraging and splendid. What we still see is that that there are homophobic hate crimes. Something like 4,600 were reported in 2013-14. Many more go unreported. Stonewall released a report arguing that homophobic bullying remains a problem in our educational settings. So I'd argue that we still have to focus on this in some domains, and I think the ESOL domain is one area where we should examine this phenomenon. And also because for ethnic and religious minority individuals, manifesting their sexual identity can be even more challenging, and I think it's also because of the other sources of prejudice and conflict that can come into the mix, such as homophobia from within other communities and experiences of racism. Now, as I said, my case study is gay and bisexual Iranian migrants to the UK. And again, I have to be selective here in focusing on different aspects of their multiple identities. And I've decided to focus on some of the aspects that are most salient, at least in my view, having researched this group for a while. One of them is religion, and that's the Islamic faith, with which many of my participants have identified or have been embedded through their socialization within the Iranian context. It's difficult to generalize about Islam and the Islamic stance on homosexuality, given that it's very fragmented. There are many denominations, many interpretations. Religion is also often entwined with local cultures and customs and norms. The two are often inseparable. And Sharia law is implemented to varying degrees in different countries as well, and that also informs people's sense of how acceptable their sexual identity may or may not be. But what the research seems to suggest is that the mainstream Islamic stance seems to be fundamentally negative, and that when people talk about why they feel that their identity is somehow wrong, if they do, they tend to draw upon Islam and aspects of their religious faith, such as the story of Lot and certain hadith from their religion that are interpreted as evidence of a prohibition of homosexuality. Looking more specifically at the political context in Iran from which my participants came, many of us will know that the former president Ahmadinejad famously claimed at Columbia University that we don't have homosexuals like in your country. I don't know who told you that. So there's certainly a sort of an obscuring of gay identity. It's invisible, and it may be tolerated, or as long as it's not talked about or acknowledged in any way. And if it is acknowledged, some very severe, harsh punishments can be meted out to those found guilty of homosexuality, and I've listed just some of them here. It's punishable by death. Anal intercourse is punishable by death in Iran, and people have been executed. 107 executions were recorded over an 11-year period. Of course, the data very difficult to get hold of. We know also that in 2005, 2 teenagers were executed, and it's been attributed to their gay identity. And as recently as 2014 as well, 2 men in the city of Rasht in the north of Iran were also executed for perversion. That was the crime that they were executed for, according to the regime. But the term hamjens gadar, which means homosexual in Farsi, was also used by somebody very prominent in the regime. Now, some people may be thinking, well, how about trans rights in Iran, given that this is a country with laws that seem to be conducive to the acceptance of trans individuals, and it's also the country with the second highest number of gender reassignment surgery procedures, second only to Thailand. And the former Ayatollah issued a fatwa legalizing this within the country. But there is one issue here. While that is splendid in terms of trans rights, what we also see is a blurring of sexual orientation and gender identity, whereby sometimes, given that homosexuality is seen as wrong and sinful, it is presented as being correctable through GRS. Now, as I said, I embarked upon a previous study of gay Iranian migrants, and several of the individuals did perceive the UK as a sexual safe haven, in the sense that it was a place where they could be who they wanted to be, and I'll present some data. They also viewed migration as facilitating a sexual self-identification, a more authentic sense of self. And as I said, some of them talked about ESOL, so I'll be presenting just some data from this study. So I interviewed 25 gay Iranians in London, and they were all in their 20s. They were here for different reasons. Some were on a student visa, some were asylum seekers, and others had work permits. And most of the individuals who talked about ESOL were indeed asylum seekers. Most were practicing Muslims. There were some self-identified former Muslims and some cultural Muslims as well, and these are the terms that they themselves used. And this study is based on interviews. So I'm going to summarize the first theme. How am I doing for time, by the way, John? Okay, great. So the first theme, being gay in Iran, a social psychological struggle, and this really draws upon that notion of coherence, the idea that being gay, being bisexual is somehow inconsistent with other aspects of the self. And we can see this quite powerfully from the quotes that I present here. It was always a struggle for me. I do love Iran. It's my country where I was born, where I lived with my parents, my family, my people. But in Iran, I was sad. I was sad because I could not be who I am. I did not have an identity. It was like living like a stranger. So we can see the incompatibility here between an Iranian identity, what it means to be a true, authentic Iranian young man, and his sexual identity. And I think the notion of multiple truths here doesn't quite capture what the participant is attempting to articulate. Because one of these truths doesn't appear to be a truth from his own perspective. It appears terribly inauthentic to him, and he's having to play a role with which he doesn't identify at all. Muhammad said, I came to a point where I'd look at myself in the mirror and not really know who that guy was looking back at me. I knew that inside I was gay, a woman basically. And we can see here how that ideology around sexual orientation having to map onto biological sex really coming to the surface here, whereby people are beginning to doubt whether he's actually a man or a woman within a man's body. Religion was clearly a source of identity conflict for many of the participants, and people talked about the pervasiveness of Islamic symbolism and ideology in the Islamic Republic of Iran, which is not surprising given that it is a theocracy. And this caused some people to question their connection with their faith. So Ashkan said, so I thought, what's the point in living if I can be killed one day if I live my life, I mean really live? They viewed migration. Now, I'm not saying that migration was necessarily explained through their sexual identity. There are multiple reasons, but I was focusing here on the connection between sexuality and migration. But this was regarded as an opportunity for reconstruing some of these problematic aspects of their identity. It provided opportunities, as I mentioned at the beginning. It provided the opportunity to reconstrue those identities that caused tensions, like their religious identity. And some people talked about distancing themselves from their Islamic faith as a means of constructing a more psychologically beneficial and authentic sexual identity. Others also talked about the ways in which they could now construct positive social relations. They no longer had to go to house parties in order to socialize with other gay and bisexual men. They no longer had to congregate in a food court that's known for sort of known as a gay social space. And they therefore no longer face those constraints of the Basij, which is the religious police in Iran, suddenly appearing and causing all sorts of difficulties. People were able to reconstrue their sense of community and their participation in it. Now in England, if I want to meet a guy and you can log on to all sorts of gay social networking apps, and there's no fear of a militiaman being behind a profile to try and trap you. So there's a sense that you can now be who you want to be. So migration's clearly conducive to a very positive sense of sexual identity. Now moving on to some reflections on sexuality in ESOL. And as I said, I have some speculative remarks to make in this area on the basis of some of the quotes from that study. Now, what some of my participants said was that within the ESOL environment, they sometimes perceived exclusion from key in-groups. They wanted to be accepted as Iranian. Indeed, they often found that their Iranian identity became more salient because they were minorities in the UK, and they had a nostalgic connection with their Iranian identity. But often this was, they sensed this exclusion from it within the ESOL environment. One Iranian guy in the class said he was surprised when he saw gay people here because Iranians are not ever gay, and it killed any desire I had to say I'm gay. So it clearly recreated that sense of threat to coherence that I've talked about. People also talked about their trepidation around coming out in order to maintain a safe space there, because they wanted to maintain a connection with Iran, to see their family, friends who'd remained there. It remained an important part of their identity. They also don't say it, they don't make homophobic remarks, but there's laughing and not so direct insults about gay people, and I have to go back there to Iran, so I never say it. So there's a sense, it actually echoes some of the themes from the film that we saw yesterday as well, whereby there's a need to to maintain a sense of inclusion within the space there, and therefore a reconstruction of one's identity here. When I hear homophobia, even from Africans, Arabs, whoever, it reminds me of my life in Iran. I forget that I'm in England. And this reminds me of a quote, an anecdote within Waddell et al.'s paper from 2011, in which they discuss a student from a country where homosexuality is not, LGBT rights are not really upheld, and an expectation of acceptance within the US, but actually surprise and shock when there's homophobia. I was in two minds about including that slide because I didn't feel that and I clearly haven't done justice to it in this talk, given the time that I have. But I just wanted to present one facet of this issue because it is one that feeds into the way that participants themselves appear to be understanding their sexual identities. And it also reflected the conversations that some of them had had, for instance, with the psychologist within the army, because some of them were actually exempt from military service. And when they had this conversation with the army psychologist, it was clearly constructed as some sort of it was pathologized, and it was also constructed as something that, you know, could be discussed further through this lens of well, maybe actually you're a woman trapped in a man's body. That was basically what some of my participants had said. So it was presented really so that we can understand some of the narratives that I've presented here. But you're absolutely right, it's very complex. There are multiple voices. We can't really separate politics as well. There are some individuals who are very keen also to point out everything that is wrong with the Iranian regime, and this can also be presented as one of those things that the Iranian regime is doing wrong. So we certainly need to be mindful of that. It is very, very nuanced. But I certainly like the work that you've mentioned. It's really relevant and can't be ignored in this debate. So thanks.
Nick? Yes. Thank you again for this paper. I learned a lot. We come from different disciplines, so you know there is an epistemological kind of layer to the question I'm going to ask, which is I don't understand the difference between the social construction and the reality. This is kind of a Wittgenstein kind of engagement with the real. So there isn't, the way I see it. So hence the ontological notion of multiple truths, because this is the way in which we experience reality full stop. This is where I come from. But the more specific question is like the relationship between this kind of coherence, multiple truths, and the temporality of migration. Because in my film yesterday, we are talking about somebody who's 40 years old, who has been in the country already for about 30, say a good 25 years, maybe 23, whatever, who is in a different phase, in a very different phase of her life, in which she's now reassembling, rejuggling all of those those multiple truths in a different trajectory. She's now, there is an inbound trajectory, but there are also outbound trajectories. Whether you actually leave the country or not, at a certain stage of your life, you start drawing towards home. So all of those multiple truths, all of those kind of, pluralities get to be reassembled into different regimes of coherence of the self that might have an impact on what, on what kind of psychological health then people experience, right? Because I was also wondering, and that's the second question, where you met the people you interviewed, because they seem to be at the beginning of their migration stage, in which in a way they need to leave Iran and embrace this wonderful place that they are trying to get papers for by saying exactly those kind of things. And if you then selected them through NGOs where this particular outbound trajectory is being valued as a validation of their authenticity, then it's hardly surprising that that's what they're going to say. So I just want to know, if you can say a little bit more about this.
Yes, absolutely. So the way I'll address the second question first. So the way that I got to know these individuals was through an NGO that's now no longer operating from within Iran, but it's now operating in Toronto, and it assists people who wish to leave Iran and move on to move into other places. And so some of the individuals had managed to come into the UK, and I'm focusing here on the asylum seekers specifically. Yes, absolutely, but they are at that stage where there's a lot of uncertainty about their future, and there's also a lot of uncertainty about whether they'll be able to remain in the UK. But it wasn't just narratives from the asylum seekers, it was also narratives from people who were here as students and who also had a much more stable connection with the UK. And they were experiencing a great deal of conflict. Some of them had been in the UK for quite a long time, and when they reflected back, those memories were actually quite conflicting as well. They caused a great deal of psychological distress. Now, from wherever we are temporarily, we're going to reflect back and we're going to try to construct a coherent narrative, and that's the very premise of continuity. And that's why I try to differentiate between continuity and coherence, because there's such thing as a sort of a diachronic overview of one's life and a more synchronic one. On both counts, people are experiencing threat, and they're also talking about emotions that seem to be symptomatic of depression as well. So these are very real experiences for them. And that's why I really wanted to kind of focus on that and really also highlight the negativity amid the positivity as well, in order to do justice to what they were feeling at the time. So yes, I've kind of become acquainted with them through multiple ways, and what I see are quite similar narratives regardless of where people are and regardless of the reasons that they've come to the country.
Final question from Luis Paulo.
Yeah, my question relates to a specific, I guess, the way homosexuals are treated in Iran, officially, how this is managed. Because a few years ago I went to a show in a museum in Berlin, and right beside the Iranian temple they have got in there in this museum, they had a couple of cabins in which you could sit and listen to transsexuals, Iranian transsexuals. And what I got from that was that there are no homosexuals in Iran because they have to submit themselves to, they have to be transsexualized. What do you know about this? Is this true, or what's going on? Because from what you said, they actually punished, so transsexualization is not compulsory.
Yeah, it's not compulsory at all. I think what we need to bear in mind here is the sort of the undergroundness of sexuality and the ways in which people engage with other people within the sexual in-group. So often it happens at parties, people are able to live out their sexual identities, but in ways that are not very easy, perhaps. And also through their engagement with people outside of the country, it makes them take a stance often on how they're living out their sexual identities within Iran, because they're thinking, well, you know, it's so much easier out there, look at what's going on there. Because so much as the Iranian regime tries to limit contact with the outside world, they continue to have it a great deal. I think the punishments seem to arise when there is an attempt to manifest a gay identity in a very open way, and when there is no submission to, as you just mentioned, to a transsexual kind of correction of this. That's when the punishments can arise.